While he was screaming for more opium, he was rotting away. His skin was splitting open. They called him the first gentleman of Europe. But now, nurses gagged from the stench of his body, collapsing under its own weight. What happens when the man meant to rule an empire can't even rule himself? You're about to find out. Born in 1762, inside the marble halls of St. James's Palace, George came into the world, already buried in titles. Duke of Cornwall, Prince of Wales, Earl of Carrick. He hadn't even opened his eyes, and history had already written half his life. His father, King George III, was a man obsessed with order, sharp lines, duty, control, and his mother, Queen Charlotte, played the part. A woman who followed rules so strictly even her children couldn't breathe wrong. But from the very beginning, George wasn't wired for discipline. He wasn't like his father. He was born into gold, but it may as well have been a cage. He rebelled. In private at first, sketching forbidden ideas in the margins of his books, mocking his tutors under his breath. By the time he was 14, he wasn't memorizing speeches. He was memorizing how to lie. At 16, he had a mistress, a private liquor cabinet, and debts from cards he couldn't play well. His father begged him to become a king. George wanted to become anything else. He didn't grow up. He inflated, and no one ever told him when to stop. By his 20s, George was already defying expectations. He drank like a soldier, gambled like a criminal, and seduced like a poet with nothing to lose. London was his playground, and his poison. He dined with prime ministers, duelled with poets, and ended his nights in brothels with the same elegance he wore to Parliament. His father, George III, watched in horror. This wasn't the heir he moulded. This was a walking rejection of everything he stood for. And the more the king tried to rein him in, the further George ran. He didn't just overspend, he obliterated money. By 21, he'd already burned through what would now be millions. On horses, private orchestras, imported mirrors and silk. He lined his walls with silk. But the true scandal was love. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic, smart, graceful, and entirely forbidden. They met. They danced. They vanished from society and for weeks. And then, in a candle-lit room with no permission and no crown watching, they married in secret. It was illegal. It was reckless. It was maybe the only honest thing he ever did. But Parliament didn't care about honesty. The monarchy didn't care about love. They cared about control. Maria Fitzherbert could never be queen. And George knew it. Still, he clung to her like a drowning man grips driftwood, because she didn't see the prince. She saw the boy beneath it all, the one still aching for freedom, for warmth. But under pressure from the crown, George abandoned her. He betrayed the one person who made him feel human. What do you do when the only person who gives you peace is the one you're ordered to erase? While George was drowning in debt and wine, Britain was rising. The empire's grip stretched like iron fingers across the map. Canada was secured. India was swelling with British control. The navy, unmatched. Steam engines roared through coal-choked skies. The Industrial Revolution had begun. James Cook charted oceans no Englishman had dared. Every continent had felt the shadow of the Union Jack. It was the age of empires, of revolutions, of kings that shaped continents. And yet, inside the palace, meant to guide it all, the heir to the throne was vomiting on velvet. As America declared independence, George IV was too hungover to read the news. As France boiled toward revolution, he was boasting about battles he never fought. He wanted to be seen as heroic, a general, a statesman, a man of destiny. But it was all fiction. He posed in military uniform, commissioned portraits of himself on horseback, and spoke in grand speeches written by others. He even begged to serve in the army, to ride with real men, to be respected. But his father, King George III, refused, not to punish him, but because deep down he feared the truth. George couldn't lead himself. He'd fold in combat. He'd get soldiers killed. And worse, he'd disgrace the uniform he wore like a costume. Can you imagine it? The future King of England surrounded by the roar of history, trying to act like a lion, when even his own father knew he was just pretending. Even though the empire was rising, the man who would one day wear its crown was falling fast, and without a single hand strong enough to catch him. By his late 20s, George wasn't just in debt, he was drowning in it. The bills were so outrageous, even Parliament blushed, private chefs, gold-plated cutlery, palaces he barely visited filled with art he couldn't name. He'd spent the empire's patience thin, and his father's too. So a deal was struck. A marriage, not for love, not for legacy, but for money. The bride was his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick, a match made in misery. He agreed to the wedding on one condition, that his debts would be wiped clean. And so, under the cold gaze of obligation, he walked to the altar with all the passion of a man signing a death sentence. But on their wedding night, he drank till he became unconscious, collapsed in front of the fireplace, didn't even make it to the bed. The next morning, he reportedly told friends, "I am not well, pray get me some brandy." That was their beginning, and the end wasn't far behind. The union gave him one child, Princess Charlotte, a flicker of hope, a bridge between duty and humanity. But George burned it like everything else. He mocked Caroline publicly, avoided her privately. Caroline was a wife in name only, a mother exiled from the palace, a political solution turned living ghost. George didn't want a crown. He didn't want a wife. He didn't even want the child they'd made. What kind of man trades his own marriage for a bailout? What kind of future king signs away a lifetime just to avoid the consequences of his past? Because the monarchy got its wedding, the treasury cleared its books. And George? He got what he always chased, a brief escape, followed by a longer fall. And Caroline? Still exiled, still humiliated. Their marriage was a stage set, long abandoned. All that was left was one fragile thread holding his legacy together, Princess Charlotte. She was young, bright, popular with the people in a way George never was. She could have changed everything, restored dignity to a broken dynasty, rewritten her father's failures with a softer hand. But then, Charlotte died at 21. In one brutal night, his legacy vanished. His daughter, gone. The nation mourned. Black cloth hung from homes. Even hardened men wept in the streets. And George, he didn't just lose a child, he lost the only part of him that might have been remembered with love. He would go on to wear the crown, sit on the throne, sign laws, host ceremonies, but nothing could touch what had already died. He was now a king without a legacy, a monarch whose bloodline ended. In 1811, the palace walls cracked open to madness again. King George III, his father, slipped deeper into illness. The prince, George IV, was declared regent. Finally, power was his. But with it, not a single soul's love. When the people gathered at Peterloo, peaceful and hopeful, demanding rights and justice, soldiers tore through the crowd with sabres and horses. Blood stained the square. George watched, and he sided with the soldiers. To the crowd, he was no savior, no benevolent king. He was a tyrant in silk slippers, a man who wore finery while his people bled. What's worse, a weak ruler who fails his people, or a cold one who doesn't even care? In 1820, George finally wore the crown, but he refused to let Caroline into the ceremony, his wife in name only, exiled, ignored, forgotten. She died weeks later, broken and alone. George stood on the throne beneath gold and jewels, but the crowd didn't see a king. They saw a man they hated, they jeered, they whispered. Then behind the pomp, his body was falling apart. Gout crippled his feet, with every step becoming a torment. He couldn't urinate without screams piercing the silence. Doctors pumped him full of laudanum and brandy, trying to patch together a mind slipping in and out of lucidity. He told wild stories, claiming he'd fought at Waterloo, that he was a hero in battle. No one dared challenge his lies. Mirrors were covered, windows shut tight, the stench of infection crawling through the halls. He wasn't ruling England anymore. He was ruling a tomb, a body trapped by its own decay, a crown heavy with the weight of broken promises. How long can a man rule when his own flesh is betraying him? Nurses wept quietly in corners. Servants whispered behind closed doors. Knighton, the king's most loyal aide, kept the grim truth locked behind a steady face. But the king was dying, cell by cell. Dropsy swollen his limbs, heart failing in the shadows, his bladder inflamed and leaking into sheets that no one dared change fast enough. The air was thick and stale. His cries, ragged and broken, barely sounded human anymore. Then, on June 26, 1830, the end came. He woke early, coughing blood, moaning in unbearable agony, called out for help. And then, his heart suddenly stopped. His body collapsed under its own weight. The man who once ruled an empire, now gone like a whisper. No cheers, no grand mourning, just relief. He died the way he lived, drowning in the very darkness he refused to face. Cause of death was reported to be a rupture of a blood vessel in the stomach, most likely the final blow delivered by decades of excess and neglect. He was buried quietly at Windsor. No cheers, no tears. The crown passed to his brother, another man tasked with fixing what George had broken. His bloodline extinguished. The Times didn't hold back. Their publication said, "A bad son, a bad husband, a bad father, a bad king." He was a shadow living in his father's light, and forever eclipsed by the Queen who followed. His victories weren't won on battlefields or in Parliament. They were in marble halls, painted ceilings, and costumes sewn with gold thread. He was a king of appearances, a ghost wrapped in silk and illusion, a man who never truly was. The tragedy of George IV isn't just that he died in agony. It's that he died without ever truly living. He wore a crown heavier than he could bear, built a kingdom more beautiful than he could understand, and left behind nothing that loved him. If you were born with everything and lost it all by your own hand, would you still blame the world, or finally look in the mirror? That is the story of how George IV ended. If stories like this interest you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to enjoy more of our future uploads like this. See you in the next video.